Welcome to this episode of Leaning Into Discomfort. I am Martin Beatty, Middlebury class of 1984, and I am the head men's and women's track and field coach.
Hey everybody, I'm Laurie Patton, she, her, hers. I am a professor of religion and president of Middlebury.
Hi, my name is Ellie. I am a junior here at Middlebury. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am the president of Student Athletes of Color.
Today, on this anniversary of George Floyd's death, we want to use this episode to talk about how his death was a catalyst for change. Reflect on what has happened over the last year and look to the future. So Ellie, I'd be curious to hear from you, someone who was from Minneapolis. What was it like a year ago?
A year ago, such a short time, but also feels like a very long time ago at the same time. Coming from Minnesota at the time of George Floyd's death, I didn't realize when it hit the news how big of a catalyst it would be, not just here at Middlebury, but also around the world, because it hit local headlines like 24 hours earlier. But I think it was an awakening inside, and just in terms of understanding the depth of pain that can be felt and how long it can be felt for, in length in terms of like history and in terms of each other's history and our collective history together as a city in Minneapolis, but also like as a state, as a country, as a whole entire globe. I personally myself struggled a lot with it. I think just in terms of seeing someone lose their life on camera is never something that is ever easy, and to see it everywhere and see the reaction everywhere. So I think one of the best things that I did was I reached out to our athletic director, Erin Quinn, trying to understand, one, how I myself could find support in my community, which has become my home here. But I also was trying to understand, how can I myself be a better ally? How can I better support my Black teammates and peers within the athletic department and throughout the whole campus, and what structures were in place? Or what structures needed to be built, and how can students and admin and faculty and coaches come together to make that happen, and to have Middlebury be a safe space for all identities and an open space. So I was really lucky to have Erin reciprocate and be able to and have that dialogue just with me, and then be invited along with Jordan Brown, class of 20.5 football, to attend a DEI committee meeting within the athletic department, and then later on be student representatives on the committee to launch Leaning Into Discomfort, to see what this could be, to build those structures of support that I was looking for a year ago.
Laurie, as our president, it must have been very tough for you to think about being a leader of an institution, and an institution that is small compared to many other universities, and where relationships are close-knit. And for you, your emotions must have been thinking about everyone under the umbrella of Middlebury College and what their feelings are. Can you kind of walk us through?
Sure. Yeah, I think a couple things really hit me that month. The first is that, I love an ancient Indian word that I teach about a lot. It's sakshi, which means literally witness with. And I think, just building on what Ellie said, there was a way in which that death being displayed on TV for everyone to see was a wake-up call that shouldn't have had to happen, in the sense that we were all witnessing something, particularly white folks, witnessing something that they should have been a witness to all along. And you think about civil rights, where a lot of folks came down to be allies in the South. And you did see a lot of the work on the television, and you did see a lot of the violence on the television, but this was something at almost another level. And I think that large scale witness was something that really impacted me. That there was a way in which people who, even well-intentioned people who kept perhaps even unconsciously looking away, or thinking that they could power on through it, or thinking that they were already allies but didn't have any more work to do, or whatever that might be, were coming face to face with some of the realities of our nation. And that was incredibly powerful. And then thinking about this community, a big learning that I had was to pay attention to the particularity of Black experience. And to be really clear, that experience is something that needs to be named and kept as a singular experience. And so much of it hasn't been told yet. And so I was thinking about what that would look like here at Middlebury and how many stories have to be told, how many experiences have to be told in, as you said, Martin, that really wonderful and personal way. We launched the Twilight Project, which is partly about sharing those stories, and also the Anti-Racism Task Force, whose focus is on storytelling, partly as a way to do that as a community amongst ourselves. And I think that the leaning into discomfort is also a way of telling stories and sharing stories as a form of support. So what hit me at the double levels, both the big picture of the bigness of the witnessing that was happening with George Floyd's death and the pain that white people in particular couldn't pretend wasn't there. And then secondly, how we as a community needed to begin to tell stories as only one among many forms of change and structural change that needed to happen.
You know, that word support is really important. For me, I really thought long and hard about how my students are feeling on my track and field team. And it was a tough time of the year because we had all gone to our homes because of the pandemic, and we couldn't really be there for each other in person, physically, to, hold each other, put an arm around each other, talk about what's going on. So, fortunately we had Zoom, but, not the same as actually being there together. But we did reach out. A lot of people talked, teammates, called each other and Zoomed each other. We would do team meetings. There were group meetings. So there are ways in which people were able to really connect. And then on another level for me, when we talk about support, we all need support. So fortunately, this being a wonderful, close-knit community, I had, many colleagues who would call me and say, hey, I want to know how you're feeling. Can we talk about this? And that was just terrific. Never expected them to do that and never thought it would happen. But it was really nice that it did happen. Another thing that comes to mind is the fact that I wasn't surprised by his death. It's nothing new, of course. But, there's that normal outrage that we all feel when you see it in front of you on video. And it really, the protest made me think back to the 1960s. I'm old enough that I can remember the late 1960s when there was civil unrest and there were protests. And I had these memories of my much older cousins, with their peace signs and Black Power fist signs and necklaces and, all those things, and Free Angela and Free Huey and all that stuff. And I remember in New Haven, Connecticut, seeing the National Guard coming into the city with, trucks and jeeps. I think there was even a tank. So it really brought back all these memories back to the 60s when, we thought maybe the world had changed a lot, and it has changed some, but in some ways it hasn't changed. Ellie, can you talk about a little more about your DEI committee work, how that has changed your experience at Middlebury College?
Yeah, I would say it's changed it in so many different ways and in unimaginable ways. Like I would never have thought a single phone call a year ago would have brought me where I am today, and with the connections and the friends and people I've been able to meet and actively listen to their story. And I think that's something that is amazing. This past year and the DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically for racial justice, it was able to happen, and we were able to have these conversations and to have dialogue. I remember when this series was just starting out, like when Jordan and I and the rest of the DEI community was trying to figure out, what do we want to get out of this? Like, what do we see? Like, how will this help transform the community that we live on campus? And we were hoping that it would allow people to have a way to learn how to talk, listen, and learn in a way that, so there's that education piece. And I think that that's something that we have achieved, but it's also something that we will continue to strive to achieve as we have expanded the topics of leaning into discomfort and the intersectionality of different identities and how those connect and celebrate the differences as well. But I also see how we were able to, this past year and continuing looking forward towards the future and long-term and structural and institutional change within our campus, how those conversations have transcended into action. And I think that that's something that could only have happened with the synergy that comes from young people. I'm a little biased given that I am a student, but I think that having that energy and having that agency and voice is something that all of us are exploring a little bit, a lot of it, while also being able to have a space that Middlebury gives us to use that, to practice, to learn. And there's no necessary, it's hard to find a wrong answer and how to learn, how to have agency and voice and to reach out and also meet someone halfway and then have like admin, faculty, professors, coaches meet you on the other half. And I think like that's something that you see a lot. And I think it's also just natural with the environment we have here at Middlebury as we are pursuing academia right now. We naturally love having conversations any time of the day, anywhere, through the DEI work that students have collectively done, not just myself. We've been able to begin to normalize having conversations about identity, about race, to name the fact that racism does exist still and that we very much experience it in many different facets of our lives. And I think that that's something that's very powerful. And it also makes me hopeful for what comes next for us as individuals, as well as what comes next for Middlebury.
Yeah, I love Ellie's word synergy. And I think there were certain things that came together this year, which were really inspiring. I think we moved a number of structures and moved a number of folks to embrace those structures so that, as Ellie put it, that storytelling and sharing and vulnerability around these questions, particularly questions of race, but I think a lot of other questions, the intersectionality is really powerful here. But from my perspective, I would say several things. I mentioned the Twilight Project, the place where we tell Middlebury's story differently, stories of underrepresented people at Middlebury in new ways. But in addition, I have to think about the board and the board structure. And one of the things that happened was that we inaugurated something I've been pushing for a while, which was the DEI committee on the board, so that it is accountable to itself and to the community about thinking about DEI in the same way that the community has begun to do. And that was really inspiring to see. And I'll never forget the first meeting of the DEI committee. And we also met with the committee on DEI for the faculty. And I'm hoping that as we grow as a committee, we can also meet with the students and all the work that Ellie's been doing in a more substantive way. We're just starting out now, but I remember having this intense feeling of a shared burden being carried, that there were now trustees and faculty talking together, and we were carrying it together. And it was just an overwhelming, I wasn't expecting it. I was just, going into another committee meeting, and there it was. And it really, really powerful. So that's, the beginning of the work. But even there, it was moving to see that beginning of the work. And the other thing, there's so many other little things that I think, came to fruition this year, were catalyzed in part and had also been building and growing even before George Floyd's death, but sort of really clarified and catalyzed. And one was our DEI strategic plan that Miguel Fernandez and Renee Wells and a number of other amazing folk have been working on, and the whole community has been giving feedback on. And so we have like a shared plan moving forward. And it sounds really bureaucratic. It sounds like, here we go again. Everybody does a strategic plan. But if you really embrace it and you have markers and you have ways of going back to a shared document, it's something that I think really makes a difference in a community, bending that arc toward justice, as MLK said so beautifully. And so I think we have a shared document now, and we'll revise it and we'll say, wait, we need to do more and so on. But even looking at, all the different things that we've been able to, our goals for this year, and what we've been able to accomplish, that's also been really inspiring to see, things like different kinds of trainings, almost half of our faculty and many, many of our staff going into inclusion and inclusive practitioners workshops, hiring a person to help work with students on the work of anti-racism and the intersectionality that goes with that. Those are just two among many that I could name. So I think even a strategic plan can give you that sense of a shared burden and shared inspiration, at the same time, because it has to be a work, and it also has to be something that gives people joy. And I think because of our students, really, they inspired us to embrace the energy and the joy as well as the pain of this work.
On the athletic front, we also have a DEI committee that's been championed by our athletic director, Aaron Quinn. That's just been terrific. Jeff Brown, our basketball coach, is our Middlebury representative to the NESCAC DEI group. And then, of course, we have Ellie here. And so we've just really have gone forward with promoting ways of just discourse for students to talk about these causes. And again, Aaron Quinn has been a champion of these causes, and you really can't have a department flow this way with such dialogue without it coming from top down. Every team, we're now pushing for every team to have a kind of their own mini DEI committee, which is terrific. And it's just in its infancy now, but the track team, as an example, we have Tuesday night discussions where we'll decide on a certain article to read and break up into small groups, and over dinner and Proctor or Ross or Atwater, they're discussing these causes. And it's terrific. So it's letting the athletes know that they're not here just to score touchdowns and hit home runs and score baskets, but
be amazing scholars.
Yes, they're amazing scholars, and education in many forms happens in the classroom as well as down on the athletic field.
And Martin, if I could just say that one of the things that I've also really been amazed by in this pandemic environment, a lot of deep commonality between artists and our artistic community and our athletic community. And I think there's some interesting connections that have been happening between communities as I think about, what the common interests are. Can you practice outside? Can you play outside? Can you rehearse outside? All those kinds of questions. How does my pod, my theater community, my musical ensemble, how is that a team as well? I think there's a lot there that's also been really inspiring for me to see.
Ellie, can you talk about how you see maybe the future of teams at Middlebury College, and now that we have DEI initiatives?
I think the biggest thing that we've learned over this past year, or that I've been able to see and witness, is how a lot of coaches in general, I would say, are making champions of life. You become a champion of life versus just like a champion on the field or in the water or on the court. And I think that's something that all of us chose when we chose Middlebury and chose to come to a liberal arts education. That's what we were asking of it, and actually having the dialogue and having a Tuesday night dinner and to discuss something and to choose to be at that dinner, to be at that table, literally and figuratively, I think is something that is what the education is asking of us. So it's a very mutual relationship that has grown over the year and with education outside of the classroom. And I think that is where a lot of the learning happens in this formative time of becoming a young adult. So I see the future of DEI. I'm very hopeful for it. I think I can see that in terms of Michael Carr, who was a student athlete here on the football team, and now he's a coach and an amazing role model, and respect him so much. And that you can just see that he is investing more of his time, more of his energy, more of himself into Middlebury, into the community, because it's a wonderful community to be a part of. And it's a family. And I think him alone, one individual, but that is a really big testament of what Middlebury does and how it can positively affect a person, and what it can do and what it will do when we do see the culture change, and as we are culture making right now, so that when you have an incoming prospective student who comes here as a freshman and they have their full 4 years here, the whole experience, you'll be able to see that. I think that's where the future lies within DEI, within social justice, racial justice, inclusion, and the equity aspect of DEI as well.
And we do want an inclusive community. We want to make sure that all marginalized groups feel welcome at Middlebury College. So in our DEI work, whether it's about race or religion, LGBTQ issues, we want everyone to feel like they have a voice and they have a home, and that they're very much welcomed on our athletic teams as well as in the dorms and in the classrooms. Laurie, I like what you said before as far as, sharing the experience while sharing the burden. And I think a lot about you as our college president, and I'm glad it's not all on your shoulders. It's wonderful to hear that the board has accepted certain responsibilities as well. But you've really shown terrific leadership and passion towards everything that we're doing here at Middlebury College. And how do you see the future for all of us?
That's such a great question. I think a couple things that really strike me. One is, I remember when I first came to Middlebury and I talked about the student voices being the crucial voices that needed to be at the center of the conversation. And I think that the project that Ellie started, as well as so many of the other student projects that I've seen blossom on campus this year, have really shown that we can hear each other, we can listen to each other. And yet that is also a skill that we're always improving. I think that people who think of themselves as good listeners should probably do more work to continue to improve what they're doing, because they kind of have stopped. And people who may not even be paying attention, the first part of paying attention and of listening is beginning to pay attention. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do as a community to maintain relationship in the midst of these difficult conversations. And that, I think, is, as Ellie put it so beautifully, it is Middlebury's gift. This pandemic year, I started and will end with, the Gwendolyn Brooks beautiful quote about, we are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond. And that is care in the pandemic, but something that students have said in so many different ways is, can we treat this work on equity? Can we treat this work on inclusivity as we have tried to treat each other in the pandemic? Can we also feel the urgency like we feel in a pandemic? And that's been a challenge that students have made to the college and to the community more broadly. And I think it's a really important one. I think what I would love to see in the future is something that Ellie said, which is that we just regularly gather, on a daily, weekly basis to have these conversations, and be vulnerable in those conversations has been, an incredibly important part. And sometimes even within the vulnerability and the pain, to maintain a relationship. And can we as a community build those structures so that that can happen? I think things like the Engaged Listening Project and restorative practices are two places where faculty and staff and students and student life can, I'd love to deepen those so that the work of conflict transformation and building justice is a part of an everyday ethic, which has been, my passion from the beginning, is just making it at an everyday level. So I think where I'd like to see in 5 years is the beginning structures that we put in place now really are deepening. And to Ellie's term, think of it as culture making. And Martin, you think one of the things that we think about all the time, like how much has changed since 1968 or 69. And, when we were 7, 8, 9 years old, and, how much even has changed in a year, given that George Floyd's death didn't change so much. How do we, James Baldwin has a beautiful phrase, just begin again. And can we find those structures to continue to begin again and deepen them so that they become a reflex in every possible way? So I'd like to see those structures deepened and part of our everyday work. And I'd also like to see, we have a 5-year strategic plan, and I'd like to see several of those things, the big goals that we have, a big conference that will be in honor of Alexander Twilight, and look at all of the aspects, both positive and negative, of his experience at Middlebury, but have that launch a new vision for the next 5 years after that. And I'm also really looking forward to that.
I think you're right. I think Middlebury has changed forever because of this past year. And back when I was at Middlebury in the early 80s, we never would really discuss these issues. People avoided them. And whether it was in the classroom or in an athletic field, anything that was really delicate, like race, LGBTQ issues, we really shied away from. And now we're at a point where we're encouraging people to openly talk about this. And people are starting this generation, Ellie's generation, they are very comfortable talking about these issues. And it's wonderful for me to see, because I didn't come through Middlebury. That I've loved my Middlebury experience. It was wonderful. It's nurturing in many other ways, but now it's even better. And it's terrific to see. Do you see it that way, Ellie?
Yeah. Ellie, what are your hopes and dreams for Middlebury in the next 5 or 10 years?
Oh, 5 or 10 years. That's a long time coming in my eyes. I also I think you put it really well, of the structures that we are starting to build in a way, and having them be at a level where they can be a proactive support for a student. So that transition between reactionary to proactive is something that I envision for a Middlebury that I will return to one day as an alum. And I think just seeing more of what we currently do. I think Martin said it well, that we do like to have discourse and to discuss and to talk while also listening as well. And I think that's something that, while I feel like my Middlebury class, not just my class of 2022, but like my time here at Mid, is something about normalizing that. So it will be a very cool experience to see it be normal, to see it be the status quo. And I think of it kind of like in terms of how we have normalized introductions with pronouns. Hi, my name is Ellie. I go by she, her pronouns. So I would like that same automatic internal response kind of you have when you meet someone new. I'm excited to see what that looks like in one more step further. And I also just agree that this past year, while very short in some ways, has definitely changed the projection of where Middlebury is heading in the best way possible.
One of the things I think so much about is something Cornel West said. I think it was in conversation with Anderson Cooper about at George Floyd's funeral. And he said, the family has endured so much pain, and yet still they are open and gracious and welcoming. And that is true of enslaved people in the United States, that amount of pain, and yet still we are here working and being open. And it really moved Anderson Cooper, and I think about it all the time. And I hope that Middlebury could work in that spirit of, even as we break open, that we are still connected and still do that work to stay connected to each other. And I think Ellie put it beautifully at the beginning about that being an essential part of who we can be as a community.
I think we will. We're on our way to doing that and being that way as a college. So Ellie Thompson, thank you very much. Laurie Patton, thank you very much for being with us. And thank you all for tuning into this episode of Leaning into Discomfort with Middlebury Athletics.